Jai Hind, welcome to Dev Talks on news that matters. On this time's topic, China. Although I had done a video about the Chinese economy with Lieutenant General Ravi Shankar, there are also some news that I wanted to give you with regards to the latest happenings in China. Some of the news that I'm going to tell you have been in detail discussed in that video. So if you've not seen that, I'd request have a look because that actually tells you whether the Chinese are heading for an economic collapse. Let's start with the biggest newsmakers in three or four categories that I've kept out for you. The first one is going to be the economy. The second one, we will talk about the internal affairs of China, as in the society and so on and so forth. And the third one, we will talk about the foreign affairs of China. Let's start with the economy. But before that, I'd request you all to like the video, to subscribe to my channel, to share this with your friends. And yes, of course, if you want to support me, do click the thanks button. It'll take you to a page where you can help Dev Talks grow a little more. Thank you so much for the viewership till now and looking forward to having you on my channel more often in the future. Let's begin with the Chinese economy. The authorities in China said that the second world's largest economy will contract about 2.6% self. The Chinese also plan to induce about $75 billion into infrastructure within their country to revive the economy. But the main point is the Chinese real estate, which is currently in a bad crisis, and the value of land itself and the entire system, which is on the brink of collapse. How did these two things balance within the economy of China? It'll be interesting watch. Going forward, we all know Chinese have been basically engulfed with a COVID wave. They've been again mass testings and stuff like that. But I will talk to you about that when we talk about the internal affairs of China. Having said that, dozens of private hospitals have declared bankruptcy within China, hospital chains, I mean to say, over the past 2 years. And these guys have been pushed to the cost of complying with the country's zero COVID policy. Now, how does that make sense? Well, what happens is when there is a COVID wave, a lot of the hospitals stop doing regular therapies and processes and operations and so on and so forth. That's where the money is made by these hospitals. Now, when there is a zero COVID policy, only thing that the hospital is doing is treating COVID patients. They're not able to meet their requirements in terms of finances and thereby resulting in bankruptcy. One of the things that we see again in China is that they're trying to raise a lot of money for their economy. And the Central Bank of China has upgraded or has basically initiated a currency swap facility with the Hong Kong Central Bank and a permanent agreement which has now been expanded to the tune of about $119.4 billion, which is about 500 billion yuan. The Chinese now will be able to access $119 billion out of the 465 billion that the Hong Kong bank holds as its own reserves. This means that the Chinese would take the USD from the Hong Kongers and give them the Chinese yuan, which is a bit difficult to kind of move around within the market. It is interesting that there has been protests within China which are being reported. I'll talk to you about that during the internal strife. But economically speaking, the Chinese banks have frozen up to about, some figures say 2 billion, some figures say about $6 billion of the common Chinese people's money, citing liquidity issues. Now, the full story of this is still trickling out. There have been a lot of different rumors that have been put across. Some of the facts that I've dealt with General Ravi Shankar in my video, have a look. There's been also a crackdown on the bank protests. As I mentioned, about 400,000 people cannot access the bank accounts, and mortgages and property developers are also facing a drag because of liquidity crisis in terms of their construction projects. One of the things that we see is that the Chinese citizens are refusing to pay their mortgages for the houses that have not yet been made by these property developers, resulting in a sort of a situation where a bank has lent money to a property developer, as well as somebody who's going to buy that same particular property is stuck with no money coming in from the property developer as well as the person who's taken the loan to buy it, resulting in a crisis. The Chinese banks are basically now instructed, and this came from the highest authority in China, to bail out the property developers, and mortgage boycotts that have been taking place by the citizens, which threaten the country's economy. And the interventions, as I said, comes on the back of thousands and thousands of people refusing to pay their mortgage payments. And they have now, the Chinese authorities have gone ahead and told those banks that these mortgage payments should not be given any penalties for anybody who's kind of missed or deliberately not paid his money. So the Chinese authorities seems to be kind of posing up to people to try and get the money flow back into circulation. One of the things is we also see there was a video that actually circulated some time back, and it came from a city or a town called Rizhao in Shandong province, where there was military tanks that were being deployed at the local branch of a bank that is being held at the center of one of these scandals that are taking place. Uh, it is being talked about that, and this has been reported by the South China Morning Post, which is very clearly stating the factor that the Chinese GDP cannot grow back without a certain stimulus that needs to be put into the economy. And that is very interesting considering the factor that the Chinese had basically declared a victory over the virus and the economic backlash that it came to it. The National Bureau of Statistics spokesperson, and again, I'm sorry for mispronouncing their names, Fu Ling Hui, said that it is challenging to achieve the expected economic target for this whole year, considering the situation within the country. One of the things we also saw as a result of the downturn in the Chinese economy is that the Chinese holdings of US debt fell below $1 trillion for the first time since 2010. And JP Morgan's Joyce Chang, who's basically the chair of the global research, talks about and says, and I quote, China may be at its darkest point. That concludes my news with regards the economy of China. As I said, do catch on to the video that I've done with General Shankar for more details. Let's look at the internal situation. China's Shanghai announced 2 more rounds of mass COVID testing. It's interesting for me to see that when they do these mass COVID testing, the kind of expenditure that a particular province would be taking through to do these tests would be phenomenal. Millions and millions of people going to 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 rounds of testing. I don't think that's helping the economy very much. But let's move forward. The Chinese researchers have claimed to have developed a first artificial intelligence that can read the minds of Communist Party members to have a better outlook towards the thought education that the Chinese have been trying to do with their citizens. HiFi Comprehensive National Science Center put out an article about this that said that the system could read facial expressions, brain waves, analyzing how attentive a member was to the thought and political education being provided to it, and so on and so forth. However, this article created a huge hangama in the social media of China and was removed on the first week of July, after a huge public outcry, as I said to you. The purges keep on happening in China. There's been an anti-corruption drive that the leadership, including Xi Jinping, has been talking about. The chief of the secret police, along with the deputy secretary or the deputy minister of China's police, just to name a few. We also see Xi Jinping trying to kind of solidify his position within China by trying to keep some opposition away using the various facets that have been built up within the CCP. There are doubts being expressed with regards his I won't call it a re-election, but his being brought back into power. There were certain scenarios that have been put across, something I will discuss in a video that I'm doing about the Chinese system itself. It'll be released shortly. Do wait and watch. Macau also has announced a week-long shutdown of its casinos and non-essential businesses as the Chinese gambling hub is confronted with one of its worst COVID outbreaks as of yet. This was supposed to be one of the most, cosmopolitan regions of China, slow and steady, it's getting under full control of the CCP. In some other news of President Xi, he planned his first trip to China's remote Xinjiang region, or East Turkestan, as it's supposed to be known, ordering the Strike Hard campaign 8 years ago since he came to power. This Strike Hard campaign was launched against the local Uyghur population, and which created a lot of issues within the Chinese and the international community. Today, US is as short as to calling the actions that the Chinese are taking within that region into a genocide. One of the biggest things that we see coming out of this place is that President Xi made a statement which said, and I quote, "Islam here should be practiced in a Chinese way as per CCP rules." I'd like to know where all the people are in terms of the protest gang that talks about freedom of religion, all anywhere apart from the world except for China. President Xi also met with the top brass of the Xinjiang military district in the regional capital called Urumqi on the last day of his tour visit to the region. This, as I said, was his first visit in 8 years. By the way, when I talk about the top military brass in this particular area, it is the same military formation that is also manning the line of actual control with India. So it's interesting to see, and this came right at the back of the core commanders talks that were taking place between India and China. The core commanders talks, as usual, did not land into any sort of a conclusion, and not that it was expected. I don't think it has been expected in China as well, reading the news that we're getting from there. On the same line, a couple of weeks ago, the Chinese foreign minister Wang Yi had actually said that India and China, the issues are very little, but the common interests a lot more. Let's kind of keep it together and move forward. But that was pretty much refused by a statement that came from India. On the 6th of July, a senior official from the Beijing Municipal Health Commission also surprised the whole nation by announcing that the capital city's residents would need to show a proof of vaccination starting the following Monday. So, which is something that was done in most of our countries just after the second and third waves. Vaccination certificates needed to be shown and stuff like that. But one of the things that we saw, there was a huge outcry again from the residents of not just the capital, but the rest of the country, which forced the authorities to take back this vaccine mandate on the night of the July 7th and offer reassurances to people that they will still be able to enter the capital's public places like, cinema halls, restaurants, and so on and so forth, with just the proof of a negative virus test or a temperature check as and when the local norms are there. It is interesting to see this particular thing from a country who had claimed to pretty much go through its entire population in terms of vaccinations. If the entire country has got vaccinations, why are the Chinese not willing to show their certificates? Something interesting for us to ponder. Interestingly, there was also another news that basically came out in a leaked censor list. Adolf Hitler, that's Xitler, is one of the amongst 500 banned nicknames for the Chinese president that have been exposed in this list. Apart from this particular one name, there's also Winnie the Pooh, Corona Z, and many others that have been revealed through this list, which are being searched for and banned in the Chinese social media apps. It just tells you the kind of nervousness that the Chinese have about their own leaders and what kind of names that they're being called. So also tells you that the names that the rest of the world are calling this particular gentleman is also trickling into China. Let's talk about the foreign relations in the last segment of this particular talk. The Chinese threaten strong measures if the House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visits Taiwan. Her visit was supposed to be done in April, but I think she got COVID and the visit has been postponed to the next month, which is August. Nancy Pelosi would be the highest ranking American lawmaker to visit Taiwan. And this was preceded by the previous speaker who visited there about 25 years ago. An interesting thing that I read is that pre-1949 official documents that that show completely discredit the Chinese claim to Tibet from ancient times. As per a project report whose findings were produced to the US Congressional Executive Commission on China on somewhere in June, it states that Tibet was never a part of China and it was invaded in 1950. The Chinese, on the other hand, claim historical ties and historical control over Tibet. The recent sailing of 3 Russian warships close to Taiwan had put Beijing in a very awkward position. The official reason of the Russian warships sailing in that proximity to Taiwan was said to be a storm brewing in the sea somewhere. And that's one of the reasons that the Russians came this way. But there are rumors trickling out, and this was again reported by the SEMP, which talks about Beijing being in a very, very awkward position, not knowing how to respond to the Russian ships in the waters that it so-called claims for itself. The Thai Navy and the China COSC, which is basically a submarine production company, has stalled the submarine projects that the Thai were basically trying to pick up from the Chinese. The Thailand Navy is insisting on German engines as an alternative to the Chinese engines, which are supposed to be very, very noisy. Interestingly, this is supposed to be the largest navy in the world. Let's talk a little more about a setback that came to China, where the Solomon Islands Prime Minister ruled out completely a Chinese military base in the country, and has also said that Australia is the security partner of choice. This was reported by The Guardian. This comes on the back of a huge turmoil that took place in the last month when the Chinese tried to make an inroad within the Indo-Pacific. The US has sailed, I think, 2 of its naval vessels through the Taiwan Strait, claiming freedom of navigation. The Chinese have gone ahead and shared their disappointment with the US with regards these particular actions. The US State Department has also approved a sale of military and technical assistance to Taiwan worth about $108 million, openly at least that is, to counter the Chinese threat. The Chinese were very fast enough to come out and issue a statement stating the fact that they would request the US to pull out from this particular deal and not go through with this particular trade that will be taking place with Taiwan. One thing that stood out from the fall of the Sri Lankan Rajapaksa family from grace is the Chinese shocking nonchalance. Make no mistake, I'd just like to say this, is that Gotabaya had cultivated very good relations with the Chinese over the past 2.5, 3, 4 years. And yet China has basically given him a cold shoulder, so as to the fact that he's not even given a place to come when he ran away from the country. It's interesting and should be an example that should be put across much harder to a lot of people who are trying to get in bed with the Chinese on various types of trade deals that they're trying to do for their country. One big development is that the Chinese who wanted to use Europe as a counterbalance to America today find themselves being pushed away by the Europeans. And again, something that me and General Shankar covered, but this particular aspect comes out a little interestingly, because till now, if you remember some time ago, the European Union was pretty pro doing business with China, as they didn't feel that particular threat. But the last EU-China summit said otherwise. One of the things that we see in China is that there's a huge energy shortage, in spite of the fact that it has increased its supply of Russian gas and oil and so on and so forth. The Chinese still depend a huge amount on coal for their electricity purposes. And we realized when the Chinese had counter-sanctioned the Australians during that whole COVID nonsense that took place a couple of years ago, they had stopped buying Australian coal. Today, there's a little bit of a word leaking out from China, and this was reported by the Bloomberg, that the Chinese are now considering relaxing some of the restrictions that it put on Australia with regards to coal, because it needs it. Well, all I would say to this is that Chinese seems to be a little smarter than the West, who's basically shooting itself in their own foot. Another report that came out, and the Chinese, I'm sure, will not be very happy, that the Indians will soon outnumber Chinese, threatening Beijing's sense of superiority. Well, the Chinese consider a large population a very huge asset, and they consider it to be a part of the comprehensive national power. To an extent, yes, but an overlarge population also is a problem. That's something that we need to look at before we start celebrating. The US has also hit out towards China in an annual human trafficking report, and it says, and I quote, the People's Republic of China uh, and the host country nationals which are employed in BRI. Now, this very interesting thing before I move forward is that they've not just criticized the Chinese on Xinjiang, they've actually gone ahead and criticized the Chinese on BRI. And they say, and I quote, the host country nationals employed in some BRI construction projects, mining operations and factories in African, European, Middle Eastern, Asian, Pacific, Latin American, and many other countries experience deceptive recruitment into debt bondage, arbitrary wage, garnishing or withholding contracts, irregularities in contracts, confiscation of travel and identity documentations, forced overtime, resignation penalties, intimidations, threats, and physical violence. I mean, the list is endless. And this particular report has put out, all these things. There is also another very interesting thing that came out of the UN, wherein I hope some of you remember, UN's human rights chief had gone into China to visit Xinjiang, and she kind of wanted to give a clean chit. On that backlash, she's now decided not to go on for a second term. But there is also an interesting news that is being leaked out of the UN, which talks about documents that is revealed the Chinese attempt to stop human rights chief from releasing the report on Xinjiang. There's a letter that has been authored by somebody in China, of course, which expressed grave concern about the Xinjiang report and aims to halt its release, said the 4 whistleblower sources within the UN. They said that the Chinese had begun circulating letters like this amongst diplomatic missions in Geneva from late June and asked countries to kind of show their support. One of the things that is written in the letter, and I quote, we strongly urge Madam High Commissioner not to publish such an assessment. It's interesting to read this and the next news that I'm going to tell you, which flows from the Beijing Olympics and the huge protest that took place with regards to human rights, with regards to the Beijing Olympics, is that the Chinese are now set to host the Asian Games in 2023. Has the world not learned its lesson? Or the protest business is doing much better than actually taking wise decisions? That is something that I'd like to leave you to answer for yourself. Thank you so much for joining me for this talk on China, its updates, and I'll be sure to keep an eye on the latest developments in the Chinese economy and come back to you with my report. Till then, like my videos, share it with your friends, subscribe to my channel, and yes, if you really feel like helping me out, click the thanks button, or if you want to become a member of Dev Talks, click the join button, which is shown right below here somewhere. Till next time for another update on another geopolitical interest of India. Jai Hind.